Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. That is the start of the year where Emma first begins to experience distress and vexation, and this video is all about how the distress and vexation that Emma goes through builds her as a character. Good afternoon, readers. I'm Tilly here from Tilly's Shelf, and I'm finally doing something for Jane Austen July. So I always do something for Jane Austen July on this channel. I think it's the best event that BookTube has to offer, closely followed by Victober. And normally I do a lot more. I just haven't kind of got to that in terms of video making this year, but I have been doing a lot of reading, watching and all of that kind of thing. So I've read Northanger Abbey, I've read Sense and Sensibility twice, because I just loved going back to that story so much that I wanted to repeat it, to explore it a little bit more. And then I have read Emma. I also watched the appalling new adaptation of Persuasion. I watched the adaptation from 2020 of Emma. That's really bad too. 2020s are going to have a lot to answer for in terms of Austen adaptations if they carry on in this kind of vein. And I reread What Matters in Jane Austen by John Mullan. That was originally because while I was reading Sense and Sensibility, I wanted to review what John Mullan said about the kind of the finance and economics side of Sense and Sensibility, in terms of the amount of money that the sisters have and how that impacts on their social position. But I started to wanting to go back to just that part, but in the end read the whole of it. And what stood out to me by that time, listening to the audiobook of Emma, which was how I reread it this year, was that John Mullan has got kind of like a bit of an obsession with the word blunder in relation to Emma. And he really believes that the plot of Emma turns on the word blunder. I think the way that he wrote his book in a lot of places was taking Austen novels and searching for words to see how often they turned up, and used the kind of like the frequency of words to dictate his analysis. I don't necessarily think it's the best form of literary analysis, but I decided to take his blunder and raise him a vexed and distressed, because I really think that blundering happens in Austen novels. It exists, and it's definitely a theme in Emma is that she doesn't always get things right. But I think her emotional experience going through the novel is perhaps more important to her character development than the mistakes that she makes. So opening sentence straight away, we're told the premise that Emma is very spoilt and has never really suffered in her life at all, really. And that's something that is still true at the end of the novel. I think Emma is kind of unique in Austen novels as having the least happen in it. I was discussing this with my husband the other day, and he always says like nothing happens in Persuasion. I was like, loads of stuff happens in Persuasion. Compared to Emma, a lot happens in Persuasion. He's like, yeah, but Emma's funny, so it doesn't matter that nothing happens. That is true. Emma is very funny. But not a lot happens, and not a lot. The characters aren't put through any real severe emotional trials. The same is true to an extent of Northanger Abbey. Catherine Morland goes through difficulties, but she is never really tested to the severe extent which heroines of the period were normally tested to. And I think that's part of the theory of Catherine Morland as a heroine who is actually more of a realistic character. But in all of the other Austen novels, and slight spoilers ahead here, we see characters have, siblings disappear, siblings and cousins and things on the brink of death. We see them going through kind of severe financial hardship or sense of financial threat. We see them, finding out that people they care about have maybe been lying to them, been untrue, been heartbreakers, so we see characters going through some really sometimes life and death moments that are very, very tense and very, very difficult to deal with. Emma doesn't get any of that. So yeah, like I said, we start with the premise that Emma is spoiled. And I think Austen has got an interesting approach to starting her stories. There's two different schools that she goes down. 3 of her novels start with a circuitous introduction to the family, and it's actually quite hard to figure out who the main character is going to be. It takes a couple of chapters for us to get to Fanny Price as a heroine, for us to get to Eleanor Dashwood as a heroine, and even Anne Elliot. You know, those characters kind of appear from between the cracks of their families, and that is very much to do with what those characters are like. Those characters are more self-effacing. They are more characters that they are in the background a lot of the time. They are observer characters, they are listener characters, they are caring and compassionate, but not necessarily the star of the show. Then we've got the three other novels start with what you could call like a premise or a universal truth, to use a bit of a quote. So you get a single man in possession of a large fortune must be in want of a wife. That's the premise of Pride and Prejudice. We get Catherine Morland is born to be a heroine. That's the starting point of Northanger Abbey. And for Emma, we just start with Emma. And like I said, the starting premise for Emma is that she's spoiled and she's never had a hard life. Yeah, and then the story begins, and it goes on through this vein of her never having a hard life. But she does start to experience some personal emotional challenges. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the idea of Emma Woodhouse being distressed and vexed for a year and then winding up happily ever after at the end of it. I do think that it's one of the most confident endings, I suppose, in Jane Austen. She's really bold in what she says of Emma's happy ever after, really. She's the one character that gets this, in spite of these deficiencies, the wishes, the hopes, the confidence, the predictions of the small band of true friends who witnessed the ceremony were fully answered in the perfect happiness of the union. So what we get is Emma Woodhouse up to age 21, nothing to distress or vex her. Emma Woodhouse, once she's married to Mr. Knightley, nothing to distress or vex her. And then we get this 1 year in between where she goes through it all, and she goes through that entire emotional kaleidoscope, involving blunders, yeah, but also involving multiple instances of vexation and distress. And that builds through the course of the novel. So distress is kind of like the weaker theme here, so I'll start with that one. It happens more if we're doing the John Mullan find the word technique. 32 times the word distress comes up in this novel. A lot of that is really, really, really minor stuff, and I think that's the point of these two words. It's still minor stuff. Everything that happens is very, very minor, but you do have a little undercurrent elsewhere in Highbury where people are really distressed. I found it interesting that one of the incidents early on in the novel where Emma is talking about being distressed, and this is ignoring all the times when Mr. Woodhouse is distressed about the cake that people are eating, Mrs. Weston is distressed that the dinner's not quite ready on time, all these little incidents of distress that are going on. We also get Emma visiting the poor with Harriet, and they're having this kind of like trivial conversation in the lead up to it. They're talking about Jane Fairfax, and they're talking about, you know, Emma reacting badly to Jane Fairfax and thinking, oh, you know, we always hear everything that Jane Fairfax does. But then they were now approaching the cottage, and all idle topics were superseded. Emma was very compassionate, and the distresses of the poor were as sure of relief from her personal attention and kindness, her counsel and her patience, as from her purse. And this is one of the actual key moments for us realizing that Emma isn't a bad person. We see in Persuasion the Elliot family doing this kind of like landowner duty of visiting the poor, but we see Elizabeth Elliot performing it as very much as like a perfunctory task that she knows needs to be done, and she doesn't even do that. She passes it off to Anne to do. In this, we see that Emma is responsible, she is caring, she does kind of know what to expect from her duties, and this is one of the few things that Emma is doing that shows that she is, you know, we need to respect her as a good person. You know, she does other things that are endearing, but this is one of the signals that Jane Austen puts in there, like she is able to respond to other pieces of distress. She's able to respond to the real distress that is going on in Highbury, which is kind of the undercurrent to this pretty fancy world that we are seeing and reading about. So yeah, that's the kind of the background of distress in the novel. Distress is like, it's a very casual word and it's used a lot, but there are other instances which I have tagged all of these, and it's so hard to find what I've actually tagged on this page. So the person, I guess one of the things that, one premise that I guess I wanted to fit into this is the idea that Emma as a character is kind of being pulled in two directions by what she wants to be versus what she is. And there's two characters that kind of exemplify the conflict going in within Emma. So we see the extremes of her character, and one extreme is Mrs. Elton, and that is the role of Emma as a kind of society woman who wants to be in control of her surroundings. She wants to dictate what people do. She wants to lead in fashion. She wants to open the balls. She wants to kind of dominate her social sphere and get to decide who is important and who is not important. And, you know, we don't necessarily like that about Emma, but that is part of her character. That is part of what she does. She decides, okay, Harriet Smith I've ignored her up to now, but now she's important enough to be my friend. And now I'm going to make her, you know, stay at Highbury and have a little room here and spend time with me and read with me. Like, she decides what the power structure is going to be. She has that role where she's at the top of the hierarchy. And that is the role that Mrs. Elton kind of wants to have and is kind of envious of. So we see the extremity of Mrs. Elton and the way that she dictates to and controls Jane Fairfax, and the way that she talks about kind of fashion and style, and in the end she does open the ball and things like that. We see that as kind of like an extension of what Emma could be, I suppose. It's the mean girl side of Emma. And it is really, really present, and that's why the character works, and it's why the conflict between her and Mrs. Elton really works. And Mrs. Elton is like Emma. She's grown up in a very sheltered environment. She's grown up, you know, in Maple Grove with the Sucklings, with a very wealthy background. Slight connotations that there is a bit of a connection to a potentially slave trade situation there, or definitely like mercantile class. Emma is a novel that's obsessed with class structures. So that lower class status that Mrs. Elton has, or lower as in relation to Emma, so upper middle class rather than upper class. That kind of like status thing is really a preoccupation. But Mrs. Elton has also had this experience where nothing has really gone wrong in her life. Now she's married, now she's happy, and the only clash that she's got is clashing with Emma. So we've got that kind of like that dynamic there with Mrs. Elton. And Mrs. Elton is a character who is vexed. You can often see her showing little signs of vexation, and she's not vexed about important things. She's vexed about things like, I've got it tagged here, is not this most vexatious nightly, when she's talking about not being able to go out on a strawberry picking day, or to go to visit Box Hill because the carriage is damaged. So she's really like focused on those little trivial life moments. The character that is the opposite side of Emma, and is the Emma that she wants to be, and the Emma that we want her to be as well, is Jane Fairfax. And she is like super elegant, super calm, super accomplished, caring and kind to people. It seems like, I mean, she's caring to her aunts. She's a good friend to the Campbells. They obviously care about her, or otherwise they wouldn't have kept her for so long. And a character who has a knowledge of hardship and distress that Emma will never be able to fathom, because Emma has never lived in that state of suspense and almost peril that Jane Fairfax has got. I've said at the beginning that Emma is the novel where the heroine doesn't have to go through any particular trauma. It's because Jane Fairfax is living it all for her. And Jane Fairfax is having the struggles that you would expect a heroine to be having, in terms of, you know, her life being a bit up in the air, whereas Emma's just kind of carrying on with life as usual. And I think it's interesting that Jane Fairfax really shows signs of distress, and even at one point she shows signs of vexation. And for her, it's so much more serious than it is for Emma. So that was my next tab for distress, is about Jane Fairfax. It seems like a really minor thing, but Miss Bates says that she was quite distressed that I'd owned that the apples were so nearly gone. And you think, oh, you know, why is she so worried about the apples being nearly gone? Well, it's about showing that her position now is that she is dependent on others for something as small as apples. She's been raised in a well-to-do family. She's been raised with quite high expectations of, you know, what her life could be, knowing all the while that she doesn't have the fortune and she doesn't have the ability to potentially marry well. So the idea that she's now in this position where she's essentially, her mum's her aunt is effectively begging for apples, not intentionally, but saying, you know, we don't have any apples. That means that Mr. Knightley's going to go back and send us some more apples. That is causing Jane very, very, very real distress, because it's reinforcing the fact that her position in life has so dramatically changed. And Emma doesn't even begin to have a concept of what that's like. So Jane Fairfax is the good side of Emma, and we see throughout this book the kind of the journey of Emma trying to not decide in which way to go, but trying to navigate where she wants to be. Does she want to be kind of like dictating the social circle in Highbury, or does she want to be kind of interacting with the people that she cares about in a loving and caring and compassionate manner, and just kind of being willing to ignore the fact that Mrs. Elton is taking that role? And she does in the end kind of navigate more towards becoming friends with Jane Fairfax and becoming seeing Jane Fairfax as a role model, rather than as somebody that she should be envying. I think it's one of the more heartwarming aspects of this story, is that we do at the end see a kind of a reconciliation between them. There's a little bit more distress that Jane Fairfax goes through, showing just like how acutely difficult her position is, when the seriousness of the situation comes out, when people find out that she is engaged to Frank Churchill. Frank Churchill's parents, well, Mr. Weston, goes to visit her, and it says that, where is it here? That she had a very great had been the evident distress and confusion of the lady. So she knows that she's done wrong. She knows that she never should have entered into this kind of illicit engagement situation that she's been in, and she knows that she's now being judged by her future in-laws for, you know, what she'd done and for her position, and you can see that she is really acutely distressed. The one other thing that we get from Jane Fairfax in terms of her inner emotional world is in the two scenes, the day after day, where they go out on summer outings. And I found there was quite an interesting kind of juxtaposition between Jane's experience of that and Emma's experience of that, where Mrs. Elton is talking to Jane about trying to get her a position of a governess. And Emma is looking at Jane thinking, you know, how can she bear this lady? How can she bear Miss Elton with all her minor vexations and all her, obsession with like social dictation and stuff? And she looks at Jane and she realizes she did look vexed. That's what she says. She did look vexed, and then acted at last with a decision of action unusual to her, proposed going for a walk. So she can see that Jane is actually going through something quite emotionally difficult. Juxtaposing with that, at the end of the next day, when Emma has been told off by Mr. Knightley for being rude to Miss Bates, she says of herself, she was vexed beyond what could have been expressed, almost beyond what she could conceal. So what she's saying is that she was really, really vexed, but she could still conceal it. And what we've seen from Jane Fairfax the day before, she was so vexed that Emma could tell, and she was too vexed to conceal it. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the difference of difficulties that these characters are going through. Like Jane is really, really, truly vexed and distressed, and Emma, is mildly vexed. Vexation for Emma, like there's about 13 incidents of vexation throughout the novel. We see it at first, it starts with her little debates about Harriet Smith getting married to Mr. Elton. Emma remained in a state of vexation too, but there was more indistinctness in the causes of hers. This is when she's had her first argument really with Mr. Knightley about who Mr. Elton's likely to marry, and Mr. Knightley said, Mr. Elton is not going to marry Harriet Smith. And this little bit of vexation that we see from Emma, it's like the start of her realization that she might not be fully right about everything, and also the start of a tiny hint of her feelings for Mr. Knightley, because she's vexed by what she thinks because she cares about him. Carrying that on through, then her vexation gets more and more severe until we get to the point of she was vexed beyond what could have been expressed. And we also get her being again vexed and distressed at the end, towards the end of the novel, when she's thinking about having to break it to Harriet Smith about all of the different relationships, and that is so undermined by the fact that Harriet's really not interested in Frank Churchill's relationships and things. So yeah, so that was just my response to John Mullan's theory of blunders being central to the themes of Emma. I hope you found it, at times vaguely interesting. And yeah, I just wanted to do at least something for Jane Austen July. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, vexed. Take care, everyone, and thank you very much to the Jane Austen July hosts.